So the Good Food Institute is really about making the same foods people love in a better way. Or I should say the alternative protein industry is about making the same foods people love in a better way, and kind of, recognizing that on one hand, meat is great. People love meat. It's not something that's going away. And on the other hand, meat production is really harmful in a lot of ways. And so what GFI does is to really try to be sort of a catalyst for that industry, and to support, scientific research, making sure that, the policy environment and the regulations around these technologies make a lot of sense, and are, actually conducive to transforming our food system for the better, making sure that food companies are on board. And so we're different from a trade organization in that we're not supporting individual companies specifically. We're really trying to make decisions that are going to be good for the industry as a whole, as a nonprofit. And so we're really just, kind of taking the bird's eye view of, what is this industry doing, where are the biggest white spaces and gaps, and what needs to happen to sort of, push small levers that will make big changes. Well, there's a few. So I guess the most obvious one is that we can produce the same meat, eggs, and dairy that people are accustomed to, and produce them without the CO2 and methane emissions, and without the effects on groundwater pollution, overfishing in the case of seafood, things like that, animal welfare concerns, and so really doing the same thing without the harms. Another benefit that I think is maybe a little bit further off in the future is that it just gives us a little bit more control over the qualities of the food. So what I can imagine, 30 years from now, when cellular agriculture products are common, is, we've got, our traditional steak, we've got, all of these same foods, but we actually have a lot more precise control over everything from, the flavor and the texture, and that sort of, those experiential properties, but then also sort of more, artistic aspects of the food. So I could imagine, what is a sushi chef in 2050 going to be doing? It's going to be a very different job, and kind of blending, tissue engineering and food, and really, being able to create new foods that we don't have today. And so that's maybe the, not as practical and urgent of a benefit, but I think it's one that that's really exciting, and it's one that's going to drive people in this direction once they have kind of the choice between traditional meat and the new versions. I think there are obviously a number of bottlenecks. If I had to pick one to say is the biggest, I would say research funding. And the reason for that is this field is really kind of unusual in that it's gone from sort of an academic, very niche idea to moving into the private sector quite quickly. And the reason that happened was it doesn't really fit into any of the traditional categories where public research funding is available. So tissue engineering funds tend to go towards medical applications, and climate change related things, I think tend to focus on sort of more traditional, energy technologies and things. So there's really not an obvious place where cultivated meat and cellular agriculture more generally sort of fits into our traditional buckets of research funding. And so a lot of the people who wanted to make this happen just sort of said, well, there's venture capital money, and I could start a company and sort of do all of this internally. And that has, its upsides, obviously, but it also has the downside of when everyone's doing this and there's all these companies in the space, there's so much research that, is really sort of fundamental basic research that's not a good fit for the private sector. And that's being done kind of, in-house in these private companies. And we could really be doing so much more to not duplicate effort on those fundamental research questions if we had robust research funding for cultivated meat in the public sector. And I think that would be, not only good for the industry as a whole, but it would be good for those individual companies. They're spending all of this money they don't need to be spending when they could just, read a research paper that someone else has published. And that's really how it should work. And then there are places where, things are a lot more specialized, and the research questions are more about, how do I take this finding and how do I translate this into sort of my company's internal processes? How do I optimize this and generate IP that's really going to add value to this company, rather than trying to create IP around, basic biology. So I think that this field is obviously doing amazing things already, and I think it could be doing so much more if we had a little bit more of a research funding structure that made sense. I mean, I'm not going to make a prediction as to a specific product, but I think in terms of sort of attributes I would expect early products to have, I think for one, we would expect kind of either unstructured or partially structured products. So we're probably not going to see, an entire steak or fillet or chicken breast or whatever it might be. I think we'll very likely see a lot of hybrid products early on. And, things that, because the cost of producing cultivated meat is really quite high still, being able to sort of supplement those things with, 50% or so of plant-based protein that's, textured in a way that it actually doesn't harm the flavor. And we're seeing this already with conventional meat, where chicken nuggets and things are available that are 50% plants, and they're sort of marketed from a health perspective of like, hey parents, get your kids to eat more vegetables by feeding them these chicken nuggets. But I think, and the sort of fundamental question from a consumer perspective, I think should be really, does this give you the same quality that you're expecting? And so I think very product dependent what sort of the threshold is for, if you put 15% meat cells into a product versus 50% versus 90%, what is the threshold where it really tastes like meat? And also dependent on sort of what the plant-based component is to that. But I think we will see a lot of hybrid products early on. I think we'll see sort of high-end products, or products being sold in a high-end context at least. So things like foie gras. There's a couple of companies that are working on foie gras. I think that that's a product that makes a lot of sense from a couple of different perspectives. The animal welfare perspective, of course, but then also the cost perspective. It's the baseline that you're competing with is already pretty high, so you can sell it at a price that's a little bit more similar to the price of cultivating cells, and also it's pretty unstructured, so you're not trying to create sort of the full texture of a full animal muscle. It's just kind of the product itself is already kind of a mush of cells, so it's a little bit easier to replicate. So that's a product where cellular agriculture doesn't have so much of a hill to climb, and can start to get a foothold, start generating conversations among the public. And I think we'll have sort of many years where we have products that are easier to make. So things like crab cakes and chicken nuggets, things like that. And then also, I think that we have to think about the sort of unstructured versus structured attribute as kind of a continuum. And maybe structured versus unstructured isn't even really the right term to use, but I think we'll see a number of successful products before we see the sort of center of the plate, salmon fillet or steak or whatever it might be. We'll see a lot of, fish fillets that are sort of 90% of the way there, And you'd probably be able to tell they're not perfect if you ate them on their own, but put it in a fish taco and it's great. And so I think, there are a lot of product formats we can think about. And I want to be really clear. I think that it will get there. I think we will get to the point where we can make things that are, fully replicating the most sort of complex structured tissues. And that's ultimately the goal. That's obviously, ultimately where we need to get. But I think there are a number of sort of stepping stones on the way there. So, I mean, I think it's a hard question because I I can't predict the future for you. Um, when I think about the future of cellular agriculture and kind of what does success look like, um, I'm mainly thinking of it in sort of a medium time horizon sort of thing, because I think the far future, 100 or 200 years from now, like we really don't know, and it's sort of fun to speculate, how different could our food system be. Um, when I think about kind of what are things going to look like in, I don't know, 2080 or something, um, I think we'll have a sort of balance between cultivated meat, and conventional meat. And I think what we'll see is that, once these products become affordable, once they become just as good from an organoleptic perspective, to the average consumer, um, you know, it's really a matter of what is this doing? Well, it's adding additional food choices to our lives, and it's saying, you don't have to, choose between the climate friendly option or the option that, is certified cruelty free, and the option that's, cheap and delicious. You can really, decouple those concerns. And I don't think we'll see people move away from meat as a whole, very quickly. But I think we will see, once we have the choice between, large scale, factory farming and not, I think, most people will say, yeah, I would much prefer to eat meat that was grown in a bioreactor. And so thinking about, the super meat, the recent development with super meat, they've announced they're opening sort of a test, I'm not sure what the term is, but a test kitchen, test restaurant sort of, facility where they're actually, they have their cell culture, set up that's kind of behind glass, and then they have their little seating area for the restaurant, and you can actually see the cells being grown. I think that's so great. They're obviously not, the first people to come up with that idea. I think, I heard Brian Spears on the Cultured Meat podcast several years ago talking about, the dream of New Age Meats having, their own meat brewery where you go and you actually have tours and then you try the product. And I just think that there's such a great, compelling argument to be made there for, yeah, you can come to this place, you can see the meat being made, everything's clean, it all looks very, friendly. And I don't think that's something we would do with a modern slaughterhouse. And so, once it's a matter of kind of having that choice, I think we'll move very quickly in the direction of kind of, having, still having smaller scale, conventional farming, and then having that alongside cellular agriculture. And I think we'll see shifts in sort of what we actually like in meat. And I think, it's such an interesting question. What is fancy and what is desirable in food? And it's so often very coupled with what's hard to get. And so a couple examples I really like are lobster and caviar. So in, the early United States, lobster was just, abundant. It was, basically falling out of the sea. It was the, sort of crappy, gross meat that they fed to prisoners. And now, because we've overfished the lobsters, we think of it as this really luxury, high-end food. And our perception of it is so dependent on kind of our place in history and, is this something that's difficult to get, rather than just purely being a question of this thing is delicious or it's not. And same thing with caviar. There was a point in history where caviar was, cheap bar food that they would give out, sort of the way, peanuts are, because it's salty and it made people drink more. So it was just free caviar at every like lower end bar. And so what I am really curious to see is sort of what are the things that we think of as really high end and really awesome because they're rare. And once we can kind of, once everything's sort of normalized and we can grow whatever meat we want in a bioreactor, what are the things that we are going to really choose based on taste? And so, yeah, I think it's not only a future where things are more ethical and sustainable and we don't, ruin the planet with climate change. It's also just more delicious and more interesting from a food perspective. I think I'm maybe kind of a weird background, or maybe not. I think there are several people with somewhat similar stories. So prior to this, I was in neuroscience. So I finished my PhD the spring before I started at GFI. And I went into that kind of thinking I wanted to do the sort of traditional academic, eventually become a PI sort of career path. Realized that wasn't for me somewhere around halfway through, and then sort of didn't really know what was going to come next. And so during that time, I was listening to a lot of podcasts because I had a lot of time to kill while on the microscope. And one of the things that that came up in one of those podcasts was the idea of cultivated meat. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. I would be really into being able to buy that in the grocery store. I can't wait for that to happen. This was at the same time I was like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself next with my background in cell biology. And eventually sort of put two and two together and was like, oh, I should probably work on this. Because it's, not only something that like a big struggle for me in grad school was like, I think that like, I do really believe that curiosity-based research is important and it's something we need. And a lot of the, really practical innovations that we take for granted now are things that came out of, someone was curious about space, or someone was curious about, the biology of the microbes that make yogurt. And like that, I think is true, but it's also, frustrating for me personally to be working on, this very specific question of, how does this one protein interact with this other protein? When, everything is kind of on fire on a larger societal level. And so I wanted to, that's a longer way of saying I wanted to be doing something that was a little bit more applied, a little bit more immediately obvious what its relevance was, which is not to say that that the curiosity-based stuff isn't important. And so I think that was a big selling point for me, was the sort of immediacy of being able to see what the impact was. Also, it's just interesting from a scientific perspective, being able to think about kind of the biology of how does a muscle develop, and then, okay, well, what's the sort of minimal set of cues that we need to replicate that in vitro. And then also, I love food. So I think that that was a really big driver for me, was, there are plenty of things that are, gonna help with climate change. But, I don't want to design a solar panel. I think someone should design a better solar panel, but that's not me. I would much rather spend my life thinking about food.